pase, pierna derecha, directo al arco, ¡golazo! ¡Golazo!
The world of football with a soccer perspective. This is Soccer Today with Duane, Rollins and Kevin Laramee, live on the Sports Podcasting Network.
And good day, good night. Welcome to Soccer Today for November 8th, 2017. Joining us to talk about the MLS Cup playoffs and the world of football, Arielle Castillo from MLSsoccer.com. Arielle, how you doing this morning?
Hey, I'm doing great now that I'm talking to you all.
That's very kind of you, Arielle. Sad day in Toronto sports. I just wanted to put that out there a quick rest in peace, Doc. That was some hard news yesterday, but we're not going to focus on that. I want to talk to Arielle about the MLS Cup playoffs. She was in Toronto for the game on Sunday. Big news story coming out of that, obviously, is the altercation in the tunnel. I don't even know what to ask you about that other than just sort of what was your sense, having been there and directly around the post game and that, of what the sort of mood was and sort of whether or not that type of what happened, Arielle? Tell me what happened from your perspective.
So as far as what actually happened, and this is not even me just towing the party line, I literally wasn't there. So during that first half, I was behind Luis Robles in goal on the supporters end. So I was kind of making my way over to use the washroom during halftime, and I noticed that something had happened, but I didn't actually see it until I got back on social media later and I saw some of the videos and whatnot. The mood afterwards, I was around the TFC guys because I was doing some social media stuff for the league, and it was weird because I guess on one hand you had the fans and the team pretty happy that they were advancing, but of course technically the game was a loss, so that was a little weird, and there was it's strange vibes. I think it was part elation and part confusion and frustration, maybe, just on how the whole evening went down in multiple respects.
Relief might have been part of what you were sensing down there too. Obviously, after the goal went in, the whole stadium sucked its breath in. I want to go back a little bit to the first leg as well, and obviously there was the fan reaction towards Josie and Michael Bradley, the booing, something that I think is going to only increase as these playoffs go forward and probably into next year as well. There were news stories here in Toronto about the reaction to that. Josie saying that he thought that maybe they crossed the line. I'm wondering, in your opinion, whether you think maybe there was more going on inside his head, and maybe some of that anger and frustration is partly maybe what caused him to lash out.
No, I honestly have no idea what's going through Josie's head, so I can't speak for him. There's no secret. I'm a big fan of his as an athlete, as a person. I think he's lovely. I think it's good to have a guy with personality. I don't think he was thinking about being booed in New Jersey when he's playing at home for his club team in Toronto. And the booing in New Jersey, I wasn't at that game. You could ascribe a lot of different meanings to whatever was happening. I'll just say that there's a lot of history at that venue and with that team and with those fans with Josie, both at club and country. So that's a whole separate thing. I really honestly don't think that had anything to do with what happened on Sunday. I think those were separate frustrations. If he is going to have a tense moment with someone from the other team, that's not the team's fans. So obviously there's a lot of history between some of the guys that play for the U.S. national team, and who knows what kind of resentments are there. But I think that's completely separate from anything that may or may not have happened with fans.
Having experienced a game in the playoffs in Toronto for 2 successive years, Arielle, did you sense this year an expectation, a weight of expectation on the players that wasn't maybe present last year? Did it feel different in 2017?
So last year I actually wasn't able to get to a match during the playoffs. I was just there during MLS Cup. But in general, I think for both Toronto and Seattle, just because I happen to be in contact with a lot of Seattle fans, there's a lot of expectation on both sides. I think both sides are maybe hoping for a rematch, especially just because of how the result went down last year. And I think there's expectation among the players in Toronto as well as the fans. You know, there's a sense that finally this might be your moment after so many years of struggle and supporting the team through really dark times. So for sure that's happening.
You know, all throughout the season, especially you being based in New York, there's talk of New York is red. Oh, New York is blue. Well, New York is out. What happened in New York in the playoffs again?
Well, with New York City, obviously they have a really great season. I think they've improved every year that they've been in the league so far. But Columbus is really good. That's it. Columbus is really good. I've said that from months ago. Don't discount them. And, you know, New York City's kind of bottled it in Columbus, unfortunately, and they let such a deficit happen that it was going to be almost physically impossible to come back from that. So that's the end of the story there. I mean, Columbus has who I think is one of the best midfielders in the league, Justin Meram. They just have so much talent there people don't think about. So that's the story with New York City. The Red Bulls, you know, I have to say they had fight in them. It was just sort of maybe a little bit unlucky that they couldn't find a second goal in Toronto. At one point, you know, when that goal went in and like you said, BMO Field just went totally silent, it seemed like maybe they had a shot. So I think their performance was totally honorable. You know, Toronto FC are, you know, one of the best teams in the league, if not the best team right now. And I think that's almost factual and no one would argue that. So losing to Toronto FC in 2017 is just not anything to be ashamed of, in my opinion.
Fair enough. I want to go back to the Toronto side here again. In this city, there is concern over TFC's form, though, over the past. They obviously had that great stretch through July, August, where they were just winning, scoring for fun, basically, and it was something I'd never seen in this league before this year in terms of Toronto FC's dominance at that period. But they haven't quite been the same since. In fact, they've now lost 2 games at home in the last 4. They certainly haven't got the results that they would have thought that they would have got earlier. And as we said off the top, they were one bad bounce away from being eliminated against the Red Bulls, a team that finished 6th in the regular season. From your perspective, having watched them up close this past weekend, is there anything you can pinpoint that maybe they're not doing as well now that they were doing back during that great stretch?
The thing is that the season is so long that it's really, I think people get worried about runs of form that happen for a few games, and they don't need to be. I think the bigger concern actually for you all going into the Eastern Conference finals is the fact that Jovinko is out and the fact that Josie is out. So I think that's cause for concern, but obviously we've talked at length everywhere in the sort of soccer ether about how deep the bench is. So, it'll be a good matchup with Columbus, but I wouldn't freak out yet. Although I do think it's not good that Jovinko and Josie are out.
No, it certainly isn't. But we haven't talked really about the West all that much, and obviously the dark horse of the 4 that are left. I agree with you. Columbus has been. I mean, maybe Columbus is a dark horse, but they certainly, to anyone who's paying attention, have been there for a while. But Houston is a surprise. Are they the clear number 4 in this, or do they have the potential in your mind to get it done?
It kind of all depends on what. Okay, so I think one of the things about MLS is that kind of anyone could maybe get it done just because of the way the playoffs can shake out. I do think Houston has been great this season. However, I think the many injuries that Portland has been dealing with favored Houston in that last result. That said, I wouldn't discount them. They're pretty hungry. I think Seattle is really hungry. They have an entire city behind them that's looking to defend that cup. So it's possible. It's possible it could go either way. I think Houston definitely have it in them. If you hear the ambient New York City noise.
I love it.
But I, Houston could do it, but a lot of it is going to depend to. There's just so many factors. I think they can win at home. I think they're excellent at home. So that home leg they shouldn't be too worried about, but we'll see.
As senior editor for MLSsoccer.com, Arielle, we always look. Well, you always look at things, and the way we look at things is narratives and headlines. If you had to sum up the playoffs in 2017 so far, what would be that headline? What would be that narrative?
To me, the narrative clearly are two teams from MLS Cup last year hoping for a rematch. Because I don't think anyone. Well, let me rephrase that. Seattle, very, very happy and satisfied with their win. However, I'm not sure that anyone would say the way MLS Cup final went down last year is the way that anyone would have really hoped. So I definitely think the narrative is Toronto looking back to get in it and not lose a cup final on penalties. And obviously Seattle will be defending it. And of course there's the whole Columbus narrative, which I don't want to get into so much of the off the field stuff, but they're certainly looking for redemption on the field for their fans. Those to me are the two storylines.
That's turn our attention a little bit to an off-field news story that happened last night in Nashville. This is I know you can't speak directly, and I don't want to put you in a spot put there, but just in your general take of that market and whether or not you think that would be a good place to see an MLS team to locate if in fact they were to win that expansion bid.
Right. So like you said, I obviously can't comment on the expansion rates. Actually, I don't have any inside info at my pay grade, unfortunately, for everyone. But I can speak to the soccer scene in Nashville a little bit because I spent about 2.5-3 weeks there this summer at the start of Gold Cup. So I was there for the beginning of the U.S. camp, and I stayed through the beginning of Gold Cup, and I did get to catch the last game of the PDL season for Nashville SC, who will be playing in USL next year. And I did get to hang out with the American Outlaws chapter there as well. So my general impression is that all of the events that I just described were very well attended. There's definitely a passionate soccer fan base there who had a local team to cheer for recently, which is a whole other chapter of sort of American soccer drama, who are hungry for something to support locally because, the closest local teams, I think some of them were Sporting Kansas City fans because they decided that was sort of the closest club to support, and, Chattanooga FC. So I definitely think they're in it. I think the success of the hockey team there sort of re-energized sports fans there. I think Nashville has a lot of recent transplants and a pretty diverse community of immigrants that's growing. In other words, it's a city where a lot of people are coming and going. So a new team and soccer gives them something, as well as hockey in recent years, gives them something to find community around, which I think is really important because, the rest of the city, people watch college football from wherever they came from, and the soccer is something new that brings them together. So I feel pretty good about their possibilities of supporting a local team. I think that PDL game I went to had 1,000 people, which for PDL, which is essentially I think it's the 4th division. It's like a park league, essentially, in some places. That's a pretty good crowd. So I think they're fired up, and having family in the area, I've just been happy to observe it.
I know that the hockey people around here can't shut up about how fun the city was too during the Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah, right. And I don't think anyone's complaining about the possibility of a Nashville away day just because it's a super fun town to visit. So I think people are kind of fired up about that possibility.
Yeah, I've thought that myself. Real quickly, the two-leg playoffs, that's been a debate, a topic point throughout the playoffs. What are your thoughts on two legs? Do you prefer two legs, one leg? What are your thoughts there?
I'm sort of agnostic about it, to be honest. I can see arguments for either side. I think there's something to be said for letting each team, baseball, you go back and forth over multiple games. So I think there's something to be said for each side getting a chance for that home field advantage. It does make the process longer, though, so I could definitely understand arguments for the other one. I think the knockout round is really exciting. So, if something happens with knockout matches, that could be fun from an entertainment perspective, although not the most fair. So we'll see.
I think the unfortunate thing has to do with what we're experiencing this weekend with the international break, Arielle. So
yes,
that's hard to get around, but it kind of, we know what it does. But and it also means that the MLS Cup final is in December in places like Toronto. And speaking of which, hopefully we'll see you on the CN Tower in a few weeks for that media party. But before then, we'll say goodbye now, and we'll thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thanks for having me on, guys.
You are listening to Soccer Today. Follow us on Twitter at Soccer Today SPN and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network. You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.
And we are back on Soccer Today. Duane, apparently today, around 2 p.m. Eastern, yes, daylight saving times Eastern, which gave me an hour of sleep more between Saturday and Sunday, and I really appreciated that hour. But today at 2 p.m., Duane, the Montreal Impact apparently will name their brand new head coach.
Yeah, and this is we all knew it was coming, and we all sort of had heard some names bouncing around. But
like Schallibaum? What's going on?
That one, speaking of narratives, that's a fun one. Maybe if you're not a Montreal fan, but that was one of the names linked. It's first I'd heard that. Nesta's a name that I'd heard linked before. There's a few other. You have the article in front of you there.
Guido Lin. There's Walter Mazzari. Walter Mazzari may be a more famous Italian name that you might have heard before, who was managing in the Serie A for a long time and the Italian national team. But we'll see.
I think it'll be Italian.
It has to be come on, it has to be Italian. I think the quick turnaround. What, 2 weeks ago was the end of the regular season, and was the famous Monday where Morabello got left behind. So on that day, we were like, okay, we'll take our time. It's been 2 weeks, so maybe it's an Italian name. Maybe it's someone that's been recruited a long time ago, or at least the connections were made a few months ago, like Saputo was talking about with his Italian staff.
Yeah, well, that was my initial impression, was that because this was happening so quickly, that it likely means that there was some established contact already. Now, you can extend that to its natural conclusion, which we've already mentioned a couple names that one bizarre one and one that's probably a little too soon in my mind, but nonetheless, both of those guys with connections to the Impact in the past. But you can also sort of not quite go that literal with it, and just understand that Joyce Puto has deep connections in Serie A now as an owner, right? So someone with Serie A history, someone that his contacts in Italy would be able to connect him with. I do think that if I'm Morabello, I might be going, WT, you know what? This is awfully quick. How long have you been figuring this out? And that's probably a fair question for him to ask, but nonetheless,
Saputo did say that answer in his end of the year press conference, Duane, 2 weeks ago. He mentioned that he's been looking with his staff of a potential candidate since this summer in Europe, in the eventuality that he would need a new coach for this season. This move is premeditated and as well prepared. So since this summer, since July, in Joey Saputo's own words, he's been preparing for this hire.
This came onto us quick, so we haven't really had time to articulate how exactly we're going to approach this conversation. So let me put my opinion out there in terms of this. I've been critical of the Impact in the past and continue to be about their instability, their fact that they turn over pretty quickly. Now, Biello stayed for a little longer than normal history, but nonetheless,
yeah, true.
They do turn it over pretty quick. So And I don't necessarily disagree. I'm also been on the record multiple times talking about Vieira and other managers that have come over that sort of were bigger names that people sort of suggested might not work out, and they said that I don't believe that's maybe old
True.
MLS thinking.
Yeah, but look at the playoff though. Sorry, look Vieira in the playoff last 2 years. Look at Martino in the playoff this year. Like he got out coached in the first time.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's debates to be had either side of that for sure. But this is what I'll say. I don't necessarily disagree with the idea of bringing in a bigger name that has a longer history in the game on one condition. Joey signs him to a 3-year big money contract and gets the hell out of his way, because I'm sure this has always been Joey's problem. Joey has been wonderful for the sport in the city because he spends his money, puts his money where his mouth is, but he's the Jerry Jones of Canadian soccer in the sense that
that's mean.
Well, he can't meddling, you know what I mean? He's not quite the Jerry Jones in terms of some stuff, but you know what I mean.
The thing is, it's because he's president. We forget sometimes. He's not just the owner. He's the president of the club. So,
which is kind of weird.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's not the only case. Look at the Montreal Canadiens. It's the same thing, you know? Jeff Molson, there's the president of the club, but Jeff Molson is a involved owner, not necessarily in the media, but he watches the pyramid below him, how they're dealing with stuff. So the same for here, the Montreal Impact. But like we mentioned, the name will be announced, and will he be present at the press conference? Probably. And you can watch the press conference, by the way, online on impactmontreal.com on their YouTube page, probably on their social media. You can watch the press conference live. Isn't it fun to have MLS in Canada with every single thing's broadcasted everywhere now? It's kind of enjoyable.
It's different era from when.
Hey, remember back in the days where we had to watch things through somebody else giving us a description on a website?
I can remember Ben Rykoff pointing his camera at a TV to show something to people over our stream for It's Called Football, Kevin. So it hasn't been that long ago that we were relying on stuff like that. But
now we will have the press conference live on TV, probably on impactmontreal.com as well, stream live in HD. Thank you, Communications in 2017.
Exactly, and it's good stuff for that for sure. Look, we'll obviously have this covered in depth tomorrow, Kevin. You have the French show tonight, so you have it covered that way as well.
Yes, so we have a brand new version of Sur la Transversale tonight. Myself, joined by our new collaborator Ludovic Martin, formerly a blogger for Fédération Soccer du Québec, so the Quebec Soccer Federation, and Captain Soccer, joining Sur la Transversale once a month now to do the Quebecers Abroad in French version to talk about our brothers playing abroad. But tonight we'll talk about as well the new coach of the Montreal Impact for our French listeners, available live tonight on the same page you get Soccer Today.
And tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. as always, we'll be live, and clearly this will be, barring some crazy event that we're not foreseeing right now, will obviously be our main topic of conversation tomorrow.
In the lingo, it's the lead so far for tomorrow. It's the new coach of the Montreal Impact. Because
and
it's
there would
2
have
weeks.
To be something pretty serious to bump that one out of its lead position.
Exactly.
So, yes, we're a Canadian MLS podcast. There's only one of the three code managers gets changed. Anyway,
speaking of managers get changed, let's change. Same topic but different city. David Moyes has been named West Ham's new manager, replacing Slaven Bilic, who got sacked late Sunday night. For West Ham, is it a positive change? Recently, David Moyes doesn't necessarily have the most shiny of record,
Well, he's, failed in his last two jobs. So, look, it's the revolving door of managers. And that's, if you look at the reaction to the move, it's universally, there's just nothing. If you're a West Ham supporter, you'd probably be hoping for some change, but this isn't even a guy there's some managers over there. They're famous for digging teams out of holes, right?
Allardyce famously never been relegated.
Precisely. Yeah. This is not one of them.
Let's not forget, Duane. Allardyce is undefeated as manager of England. The only ever manager to have a 1,000 coefficient of success with the England national team.
Yes, this is something to brag about for sure, and a pint of wine. What more can you ask for in a man? But
while you're asking for shady contracts in a Thailand restaurant.
With good times if you're a soccer podcaster. Anyway, yeah, in terms of West Ham, what to say about it? Like, he did well at Everton with what he had. I think people underestimate the talent at Everton, and they what their problem is they lack depth. They have some pretty good top end, always have, and he did pretty well with that. Obviously, the United job, that was thankless in many, many ways, but he hasn't done anything since. So had he, I would have forgiven him for the United stuff. United was on, Alex Ferguson left the cupboard fairly bare. They put a lot of resources into getting that last title for him, and they got it. So good for them. But nonetheless, there was a lot of players that had played out the string at that point, and there weren't a lot of replacements. And Moyes was always set up to fail that job in many, many ways. So you can put that aside, but it's what's happened since that makes you give a question. At any rate, not much to say. There's not much to break down either, because this is really a wait and see at this particular point when it comes to a position like that. Since we're talking managers anyway right now, this was scheduled first. Well, it's all got screwed up because of the impact thing. We were originally going to talk about Nashville in here. We might as well talk about the Friedel rumor that came out the other day.
Well, I think it's almost more than a rumor. And, Ron Waxman, we don't talk about him enough. Player agent who lives in New York, and if you follow his social media, you have a beautiful skyline of New York at night, but you also have some thoughts on personnel and players and actors in the world of soccer in North America. And he talked about Mitchell Byrne, the general manager of the New England Revolution, and how in the last 2 years hasn't done a great job, and how he surrounds himself with non-accountable people, and he is non-accountable, and that was the biggest disappointment. And that's not on Brad Friedel. It's just the competence, the skill set is not present. And again, a personal friend of the general manager of the New England Revolution. So if this materializes, you're wondering if this is for the best interest of the actual team of the club,
I'll give there's a very concrete example I can throw back to that a lot of people in Toronto will remember, and probably most of our listeners will remember as well. And that's, of course, Ryan Nelson. Friedel's a bit, further removed from the playing side at this particular time, but nonetheless, it's a similar kind of situation where you have a guy
he's retired,
at least he's not playing still. But it's on the Vocal Minority podcast, which is my favorite, TFC comedy podcast. Basically, they sometimes lament deeply how TFC is now functional because it's no longer as easy for them to find material. But
I'm just shaking my head, still thinking about how they got Nielsen while he's still playing. Hey man, you want to coach? You want to come with us and coach? Well, I'm still playing. Yeah, we know, but come on, you can do it.
Well, yes, I was at the press conference, so I don't need to be reminded. I lived it. But nonetheless, and you know what? When it came right down to it, Ryan Nelson wasn't terrible, but he just didn't have the
team was.
Yeah, well, the team was pretty bad, but he didn't really do a terrible job, all things considered. But he was always doomed. And when you see how he was brought in that weird sort of Kevin Payne era, he was a buddy with Kevin Payne. They, at least they had a long-term relationship. Kevin Payne didn't really do a search. He just said, oh, well, I want to bring my buddy Ryan in. He's always wanted to be a manager, but he had no experience that would ever point to the idea that he could manage at that level. Now, some people could say someone like Patrick Vieira didn't either, but Patrick Vieira at least put his time in at Manchester City in terms of looking at, well, if people aren't familiar, what he did is that City said, we want you to work for us. We want you to be part of the family moving forward. And he said, well, okay, but I'm not sure what I want to do. And they literally had him try everything. Like, he worked in the business side of the operations for a while. He went, obviously, he managed the elite development squad, so the highest level of their academy, and that's where he came from most directly. But he did like all their stuff in the club too, and then finally decided, no, yeah, this is what I want to do. So he put a little bit of time in. This is more of a case of just like, I'm just going to pluck a guy, and that's why he reminds me of Ryan Nelson in this particular case. And you've got managers you've got assistant managers out there that have done a good job that might be begging for a position. I'm not going to pretend to name 60 names here or something, but there always are. There's got to be people out there like that. You've got people like Mark DeSantos that we talk about a lot.
Yeah. Is he a name possible for 2 p.m.? I don't think so, but maybe.
Yeah, well, that'd be. I think that would get Impact fans very excited if that were the case.
Yeah,
but nonetheless,
it's not going to happen. He's still in the West Coast right now, coaching his team. So I don't think that's going to happen.
Forgive me, I'm working midnights, but the name that's linked to everyone, the Cosmos manager, do you have it off the top of your head?
Yeah, Giovanni Savarese. No, I don't think.
Thank you. Yeah, that's another name that a lot of people are clamoring about, and these guys just never seem to get a look. And
that's where I was going with this. I'm like, what message does it send? If Friedel is hired as New England's new manager, what does it send as kind of a message to coach that are trying to become professional coach in Major League Soccer, coach that are trying to pay their dues and coaching in the pyramid and making their way up? What kind of message is it for them? That you'll never get the chance because we're going to take someone with just a name and no experience?
Yeah, well, no, I hear you. And I mean, look, all sports has an element of copycat to it. And you look at Major League Soccer, you look at the success of guys like Greg Vanney, who came from a similar thing. Like, I mean, we can make fun of Ryan Nelson, but the reality is that the Vanney hire wasn't much different.
But Vanney was given tools. Vanney was not just given like a very terrible car and say, come on, go win the Indianapolis 500 with it. It wasn't given like a Lada and say, go win a race. No, he was given basically, yeah, you know what I mean? He was given the best ever roster and the deepest roster in the history of a Major League Soccer and told, don't F this up, basically. That's a totally different mindset than Friedel will have if he becomes manager. It's basically, look, we're giving you this, trying to make some chicken salad out of it.
Yeah, and we know how you make chicken salad, and it doesn't involve the ingredient that we're referring to. But
yeah,
I just think that look, this is a broken record. We've had this conversation before in many ways, and I think Kevin and I agree on this: is that there are some managers out there, and because we're Canadian, we do tend to focus on DeSantos. And I'm not sure. In fairness, I had this conversation briefly on Twitter with Wes Burdine the other day, 2 days. My days are mixed up because I'm working midnight. So sometime recently, I had a conversation with him about MDS, and it was sort of the conversation that sort of moved to the point is, okay, well, maybe he's not the exact pick that I'm thinking of, in the sense that he's never really managed high-end talent. He's always been a guy that's gotten people to overachieve, but maybe that's what New England needs. So I would suggest that people should be looking at guys like him, not just him, but guys like him that deserve that chance and are hungry for that chance. But they still, we talked about Moyes a minute ago, they just keep rotating, because that's the other thing about sports, Kevin, is that they're copycats and they're conservative. No one is ever going to be massively criticized for hiring the same old. They'll be criticized a little bit, but never like, oh my God, you are incompetent. What are you doing? When you hire someone like, and I'm going to pull another TFC name out of the hat here from the past, like Aaron Vinter, which is completely outside the box, and it falls on its face, then you're in trouble too, because you can't make a mistake like that.
Exactly. That's why I don't think Schallibaum will be named today. But if he is, well, I'll eat my words tomorrow. All
right. Couple, I don't know. We might as well just push through at this point, Kevin. Couple quick bullet points. Robbie Rogers retires. Obviously, he was a good player. I think we should start with that. He was on that great 2008 Columbus Crew team, which I think is, grotesquely underrated in terms of the great MLS teams of all time. They were a double winning team. They were a dominant team in a way that few have. They're maybe in the era in which I have most closely paid attention to MLS soccer, which is obviously since TFC came in 2007. Forward, I think that they in my mind, the best MLS team I've seen, and he was part of that. But he's most known, of course, for becoming the first, and I've got to say this carefully, the first openly gay male team sport player in North America.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, because there were females that were out, and that is, I think, an important thing to stress. And obviously, there were some players, there were some players that were out in rugby in the UK, for instance. So That said, it clearly was a brave decision for him to do that. It clearly was a decision that we didn't necessarily know where it was going to go, and he deserves credit for that. If we're just looking at his playing career, we wouldn't really be talking about him today, and that's the blunt truth. But nonetheless, for having the wherewithal to be confident enough in himself, and for the book that he wrote, which I think was a very important book and I did read that several years ago, and it was written almost in a YA kind of format, and I think that was on purpose. It was a very easy read, and a read I think that was designed to have struggling with themselves 14-year-old athletes read it and say, okay, if he can do it, I can too. And that's important, and we should tip our hat for that, Kevin. Quickly, any thoughts on that before we move on to Nashville to end the show?
I'm sure it's not the last time we'll see Robbie Rogers. He'll appear somewhere on our television with the education and the presence he has on television. I wouldn't be surprised if he makes a good analyst or a good TV presenter in the next few years. So I'm sure we'll see Robbie again. Fair
enough. And if you read the book too, he talked about how much he loved sort of fashion and broadcasting and stuff like that in the book. So that's something that maybe he has a future in, and we wish him luck. All right. Kevin and I have talked about Nashville a few times already. I think that just because
we need to talk about Detroit. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but we need to talk about Detroit too. So let's start with Nashville, and we'll get to Detroit.
Sure. Okay. Basically, if you haven't heard the news, there was a stadium proposal, $250 million stadium. That's the cost that's being thrown out there. The city has committed to giving $25 million towards the stadium. That means that the owners are going to front the rest of it. So this is not a complete public funded stadium. It's a partially funded or publicly funded stadium. That's a mouthful to say. There are still people that are going to criticize the $25 million. That's their right politically to disagree with that, as Kevin and I talk about on our other show that is one day going to come back. It's a soft benefit versus hard benefits, and you have to make your own choice as a taxpayer, as a voter in whatever city you live in, whether or not there's enough soft benefit in that for you to think $25 million is a worthwhile investment.
But it's surprising to me the amount, though, like how big a stadium is going to be. We're talking about $250 million for a Major League Soccer stadium, soccer-specific stadium. That would be like almost unprecedented.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to not just MLS's growth, and that's part of it, but I think it speaks to the overall sports growth, and they're looking at where the sport's moving forward in terms of hosting of Copa Americas, potentially involving the South American teams moving forward, hosting big U.S. national team qualifiers, maybe
World Cup 2026.
Exactly, and I think there's a lot of stuff going in there, which makes these stadiums more viable to cities and more exciting to cities. And again, I don't want to get into the politics of stadium building right now. That's a topic that, if you can look at our archives on Five Rings, if you wish, we've talked at length about it in the past. Our opinions on it are well stated in that, and I encourage you to go back and listen to that show, which many of those shows hold up on their own, even years later. They were designed that way, and they're not all about individual results. So at any rate, look, I think it's almost a shoo-in that Nashville's in there, and they've gone from being a complete dark horse to being, I think, probably, I'd say the biggest favorite.
Yeah.
If I'm sliding odds right now, they're 2-1. Like I'd be shocked if they don't get a club at this team.
And the reason behind those odds too is because Detroit has literally effed the bed last week. There was an agreement between Dan Gilbert and I forget the other name of the owner in the prior group for the bid for
place Cleveland Cavaliers owner. So
yes, exactly. Yes, that's Dan Gilbert. But the owner of the Detroit Lions as well has joined the group now, the ownership group, and the proposal does not include the building of a new stadium now, but the use of Ford Field, which is where the Detroit Lions play. And not again, one of the points, one of the criteria for selection or election, depending how you look at it, is the soccer-specific stadium, and at least a stadium that is built in a way that would favor soccer watching, like at least in Atlanta. It might be an NFL stadium, but Major League Soccer was thought of in the building of this, which is not the case for Ford Field. And that move might save money for Dan Gilbert and company, but that move actually impedes their chances of getting one of those franchises, in my opinion.
Yeah, and in many other people's opinions. I think Detroit is still a market that they desperately want, which, well, I give them, and again, this is another topic we talked about before, but the market size and the market sexiness, for lack of a better way to put it, is to me the biggest factor beyond stadium that MLS looks at in these expansion bids. That's why I think Phoenix still has a chance, even though we don't hear much about them, so long as they can figure something out in the stadium front. But this was certainly a setback to Detroit's bid, and it did really open the door, in particular, I think, for Cincinnati. I think MLS might even be looking at this Columbus-Austin stuff with an eye that there's 3 good expansion bids in the East that they want to take care of, and then if they shift one of the Eastern clubs west, then they get that balance that they desire, and then they don't have to move a team over, play dominoes with Houston again or whatever. Which is what they might have to do otherwise. So, look, I want Detroit to get a team for selfish reasons, as I've said before, but I also recognize that it is a good market. It is a market that most major league, and, by virtue of its name, MLS thinks it's major league, leagues in North America are in. I mean, in fact, every other league is in Detroit. It's one of the 4 sports cities out there. So, MLS would complete the trick there. And it's, again, to go back, and we don't talk about Phoenix ever because there's not much news that comes out of it, but I can't help but think that Phoenix has a great chance simply because that is a very desirable market for all major league sports that are out there. They all want in there, and they're all mostly in there right now. So
Drogba didn't go to Phoenix just to be a USL owner and play some games this season,
Precisely. Yeah, let's just say Detroit does get in. If you're looking objectively at all the markets in the United States, Phoenix is the biggest one left. So don't sleep on it, is what I'm saying. They have to figure some stadium out there. And what's that mean for Sacramento? Well, what I've been saying about Sacramento for the last 2 years, guys.
Poor guys.
Go Rhinos.
Yeah, Sacramento is the new Rochester. Maybe. All right, Duane. As always, you can follow Duane on Twitter at 24th Minute and myself at Kev Laramee. Thank you to Arielle Castillo for joining us today on the show. You can follow her work on MLSsoccer.com and on Twitter at Arielle C. Until tomorrow with more news on the new Montreal Impact manager. As always, have a great soccer.
You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.